So here we are again, another episode in Parmenides, and another episode in general of this podcast, this philosophical experience. Now, I've been feeling of late a bit uncertain. I've noticed that in my reflections, it takes a considerable amount of time to come to maybe not a conclusion, but to exercise the mind to a place where I feel that I've gone back to an earlier point, that I've caught a familiar wave. There still seems to be a lot of territory to explore. And at times this can be frustrating. At other times it can be quite exhilarating, depending on where I am mentally, fatigue-wise. I may accept it with rigor, or I may fail to rise to the challenge. But it is a challenge nonetheless. And I suppose that this is the principal reason why to participate with this material at all. We grow from it, we learn from it, and somehow, in some ways more explicit than others, some implicit, it affects us in our daily lives. If we engage with it in this manner, day in and day out, those who also engage in it form, I would say, a sort of a brotherhood or a close relationship. We know the sacrifice, we know the struggles that are made. And I hope not to speak too highly or hubristically here, but I wanted to say, from my own heart, from my own perspective, that all those who may be wrestling with this material or adjacent material, I'm thankful for you, and I'm thankful that I can be a part of that shared experience. And as for my part, I say this because when I approach something anew, for which I know that there is going to be a mental strain, a productive mental strain, I have to get it warmed up. I have to get it moving. And a little pep talk, I think, is one of those things that help me quite a bit. And considering others that are also in the same boat, I find it inspiring for their imagined strength. Is something that I value. But also we have to understand that we are in this to improve ourselves, as I've mentioned. And so this takes the primary attentive focus. And I've been noticing in the gym lately, and as I said, I go in these waves, and I correct them when the waves become disagreeable, but even in the gym, I've noticed that in the middle of the heat of my expression, my exertion, that there has not been the type of strength that is needed to do some serious, productive mental work. And so I wish, if this maybe perhaps is a sort of prayer, I wish that this experience now turns to be a good one. And I plan to spend some time on it. I'm not sure how much actual recording that will amount to, but I'm going to sit here in this chair and give it some time. And I hope if there is anybody that is listening, that they do the same with their own time. What about this? Says Parmenides. Do you think that the one can be older or younger than, or the same age as anything? Yes, why not? Because if it is the same age as itself or another, it will surely partake of likeness and of equality of time, of which likeness and equality we said the one has no share. Yes, we did say that. And we also said that it does not partake of unlikeness and inequality. Of course. Then, being like that, how will it be able to be older or younger than, or the same age as anything? In no way. Therefore, the one could not be younger or older than, or the same age as itself or another. Apparently not, says Aristotle. So if it is like that, the one could not even be in time at all, could it? Or isn't it necessary, if something is in time, that it always come to be older than itself? Necessarily. Isn't the older always older than the younger? To be sure. Therefore, that which comes to be older than itself comes to be, at the same time, younger than itself, if in fact it is to have something it comes to be older than. What do you mean? I mean this. There is no need for a thing to come to be different from a thing that is already different. It must, rather, already be different from what is already different, have come to be different from what has come to be different, and be going to be different from what is going to be different. But it must not have come to be going to be, or be different from what comes to be different. It must come to be different and nothing else. Yes, that's necessary. But surely, older is a difference from younger and from nothing else. Yes, it is. So that which comes to be older than itself must also, at the same time, come to be younger than itself. So it seems. But it must not also come to be for more or less time than itself. It must come to be and have come to be and be going to be for a time equal to itself. Yes, that too is necessary. Therefore, it is necessary, as it seems, that each thing that is in time and partakes of time be the same age as itself, and, at the same time, come to be both older and younger than itself. It looks that way. But the one surely had no share of any of that. No, it didn't. Therefore, it has no share of time, nor is it in any time. It certainly isn't, as the argument proves. Okay, so I've read a couple paragraphs there. Now it's time to do some work and go over these again and see what we can make of it. So part of the first paragraph, we're discussing time in relation to the one. Again, Parmenides asks the question, do you think that the one can be older or younger than, or the same age as anything? Now, we've already established on previous episodes that the one does not partake in measure. Time is to be a measure. Now, just looking at Google for some definitions, I have one here that I like. It is to estimate or assess the extent, quality, value, or effect of something. Now, before I know that we've discussed measure, I'm not sure if we've discussed its definition, but I know that there has been conversation about why the one precedes measure. And it often becomes difficult with language because we speak in terms that are all measure-based. Surely, it's observation-based, and by that there's a degree of measure involved in it, and it's natural to us. It is the way that we take in information and perceive things. There's another definition here. To ascertain the size, amount, or degree of something by using an instrument or device marked in standard units or by comparing it with an object of known size. And we use this measure more broadly than just the tools-based. Of course, I mentioned that our own interpretation of information is a measure of sorts. But there's another definition here that says, judge someone or something by comparison with a standard. So if you're judging someone, this is a little bit more I would say that there's a different aspect than if we were to measure something that is relatively fixed. The dynamism, as it relates to individuals, creates an interesting landscape of measure. So I'll periodically come back to this question, but I think we're going to be taking some tributaries here. So again, the question is, do you think that the one can be older or younger than, or the same age as anything? And now I went right to the principled case, skipping time altogether. Time as it relates to age, obviously. And I did this, I think, in a sense to go a little bit deeper, to broaden our understanding of why not just time, but all measure is inappropriate to use when we are considering the one. So I'll try to circle back eventually and get to the specific measure, which is time. And maybe I should give a little bit more of a, tighten this up a little bit and say that a dimension is an aspect that can be measured. At least this is how I see it. And time would be in that. So time would be a dimension rather than a measure. And there are different ways by which we can measure time, I suppose. But the relationship is very strong between measure and dimension. So in order to understand measure, we get into those fundamental qualities, fundamental descriptors of what a dimension is, and by extension, what time is. So again, the the definition that I like is estimate or assess the extent, quality, value, or effect of something. So all of these I think we can go through. I'm most interested in quality and value, but I want to start with the first. Estimate or assess the extent of something. So much like the question that asks about the time of the one relative to another thing, we can ask the same question, what is the extent of the one? And I think an extent implies that there is boundaries by which we can identify where it begins and where it ends. In order to understand that more deeply, I think we have to understand what a beginning is and what an end is. And in what context are we speaking about it? Given that we've been talking about the one, primarily in the context of being, or that which is, we've been considering the intelligible order and the sensible order. Of the intelligible, we have that which is non-instantiated, perhaps. It is the domain of non-material determination. In which identities, structures, and relations are what they are by being intelligible rather than occupying space or undergoing change. So the key traits of this intelligible order, this non-spatial, non-temporal, determinate without material composition. We have a ground of intelligibility. It's accessible by the intellect, not by sensation. Now, the sensible order is the domain of material instantiation and change. In this order, intelligible identities appear under conditions of space, time, and differentiation through parts. The key traits of this is that it's spatial, temporal, composed of parts, subject to motion and alteration, expresses intelligible structures materially, accessible by sense perception. So a very basic definition of both. In terms of the intelligible order, what is, insofar as it is intelligible and structured. Sensible, what is, insofar as it is materially instantiated and perceptible. And the relationship between the two is that the intelligible order grounds what things are. The sensible order expresses how they appear. So going back to our definition, of measure, and going back specifically to the estimate or the assessment of the extent of something, I think we have to both consider these sensible aspects of order, of reality, and also the intelligible. That's why I bring it up. So back to this beginning and ending. It's very easy to stay in the sensible order of things because it's how we relate to reality. Most readily, I think. Though again, perhaps this is because my mind has been brought up in this material milieu of material causes and material effects and all of this sort of thing, which is not a bad thing. It's just one part of the broader understanding of this. But this relationship, the anchor relationship that I mentioned a moment ago, that the intelligible order grounds what things are, and the sensible order expresses how they appear. And much like the relationship that I have between my knee, it is a part of me. I don't mean to use this analogy in the sense that the knee is a part of a unified whole. I don't mean to go there. I mean to say that it's an intimate and close relationship, inseparable. Of course, I could still live without my knee, but that's beside the point. They're attached. This being as it is now is using both. And I understand that there are limitations to this analogy, but we're not going to get into that. So I say all of this to say that when we talk about the beginning and ending of something, if I use a sensible example, let's try not to just keep it at the sensible and say, and consider both the material but also the intelligible grounding of the thing. And I think that this will provide us with a broader understanding of where we are and of how to understand how the one does not participate in this beginning and ending situation. So now the question is, well, what is a beginning? If something comes to be, it is operating on a ground of being, and that is fundamental, that there is something, that there, at the basic level, that there is a thing, that there is thing, that there is the one, for which what we would call a beginning to take place. Or we would say an initial cascade, perhaps. In my mind, I want to say an initial cascade of effects. This, I'm sure we can modify. So if we stick with an initial cascade of effects, which, by the way, is another word that is in our definition, what we are speaking about is a series of relationships that occur at a point that is, I was about to say beyond, but that would open up another can of worms. It's not beyond, but it occurs at a point where the purity of the one, absolute oneness, no longer is expressed in terms of absolute ground. And that is to say that what is beginning, or what is coming to be, is influenced by difference. That now the thing that is intelligible. It is on one hand, I want to say that it is perceivable by an agent. On the other hand, I want to say that by the influence of difference, we have this expression of comparison, of sameness and likeness, of unlikeness. All of these begin to emerge. Along with unification particularly its unification as it relates to multiplicity. And we can throw in parts in that as well. So where are we in terms of this beginning? Well, we've started with something that already is. This is the ground. It is the one. It is purity of being. And it is now exposed to, or rather, I don't want to use that language, because if I say it is exposed to, there is an implication that there is difference between that which is and that which is being measured, or that which is now being expressed through difference. The terms here, as we've spoken about before, don't apply to the one, because I could just as easily say that it's also not the same as. And the reason that we can do this, we can get away with it, so to speak, is because the ground is something that precedes, not necessarily in time, but in terms of order, that intelligible structure that participates in difference. And if it precedes that, it is going to precede those things that the relationship between difference and the ground of being necessarily facilitates, which I think is all of measure. The beginning affords us with a particularly interesting reflection, though, because it forces the mind now to think about the relationship between the ground and difference. And this is where the material mind, I think, comes into some issues, because we are so used to this causal pattern, this causal relationship, that it's difficult to get away from. Like I think about one of those, I don't know if you call it a toy or not, but there's the metal balls that are hung by a string that are hanging from a metal frame. You bring one ball away, and the kinetic energy is transferred through the balls in the middle, and then the one at the end comes out to the side and then comes back, and it's just this clicking back and forth. But the beginning cannot participate in this causal, familiar pattern of beginning. I think this is partly due to what we've discussed before about the nature of the one and how it does not participate in the characteristics that are described to it. It is not just the one and that it births something. If it births something, then it is something separate from that which it has created. The isness is the principle by which things may begin. And it's not necessarily a matter of the sameness or likeness or unlikeness or time, whatever we have to say, to be a necessary descriptor of that ground. Because the principle is something that is maintained. It is something of the substrate of reality, the substrate of identity, of intelligibility at all. What that intelligibility may participate in will then be subject to the various descriptions and determinate factors and measures that we come up with. Now, there's always a risk here. My mind is always thinking about it, that I don't necessarily want this to feel as though we are constantly copping out of a good explanation. When I was in the Proverbs, reflecting on the Proverbs, that is, there was an image. I think it might have been the Psalms too, actually. But there was an image about the centrality of being, that which is, we can call it the one, I guess. It was extending into a space. I'm not sure I would use the exact imagery now, but it's still a useful image for the time being. Almost like a pillar, let's say. And off of this pillar, or like a tree, and off of this tree, there are all these branches. All of these different tributaries through which being was made different. Was going through all of these experiences of unification, deunification, is experiencing multiplicity and unity. And there is this plurality that exists, but exists compartmentally, not absolutely. All operating on the substrate, or I was going to say material, but the ontological ontological value that was given to it by the One. And all along the way, especially as it gets closer to the central aspect, to the trunk of the tree, we have all of these interesting relationships, but also principled expression, such that while at the end maybe a leaf would be a human being, or a small branch would be a human being, who knows? The human being and the branch, by the way, having this capacity to see and to create and to extend that being, to sort of throw it farther afield and have more tributaries, and plant the seed and have more tributaries come from it. There are issues as it relates to exactly what the space the seed is planted into is creating, And if we are representing the one as a tree, then the tree is in something, there's a farther substrate by which we are thinking about this, and so the analogy sort of breaks down there. The tree itself would be sort of the beginning. Even the trunk of the tree would be the beginning. It wouldn't be the one. The one would be everything that allows it to be, everything that, sticking with the analogy, would be the substrate. It would be the substrate, it would be the air around it, it would be the environment that affords its experience, sort of the oxygen in the atmosphere and all this sort of thing. It would be all of that affords its condition. Again, the material analogies break down. I think that's fairly obvious. But I suppose the major question that it comes down to is the matter of difference. And it's not really a matter of pluralism that I struggle with, because I can see how it exists, as I mentioned, compartmentally. And by pluralism, what do I mean? In the sense of the sophist, the dialogue of the sophist, we established through these chess pieces, the king and the queen, being and non-being. Being was the king, and non-being was the queen. And a type of pluralism developed such that their marriage, their interaction, was the thing that afforded all that is, all the difference, everything that we can identify and see. All of that which we can see as compressing into one and falling away into many, or of the things that are one identity, we can identify the different aspects and parts of them that make that identity. All of this. There's a plural of this experience. And it's not just unique to one thing. There's many things that undergo processes and have parts and have singularity, all of this, right? But the plurality, again, I say is compartmentalized because it's not the whole of the thing. It's a big part of the experience, surely. But the pluralism and this image that we've now gotten to. One more thing I'll try to describe here. When I was at there's a furniture store or a home store near me. It's not Home Goods, but it's like Home Goods in a way. It's called At Home, and they have a bunch of decorative items for one's house, as you would expect. So like rugs and end tables and statues, all this sort of thing. And they have a section on art. And there's a couple aisles that have these pretty stereotypical, but also pretty interesting. There wouldn't be statues, sculptures, I guess, of the traditional tree. And you could see depending on the one you get, there's, and I don't own one, so I kind of wish I did so I can look at it, but it's a circle, and then there's a tree in the middle. Sometimes it's made of wood, sometimes it's metal, sometimes it's just a picture where the tree is white and the outer surface is black, or the tree is black and the outer surface is white, whatever the case is. But the analogy is interesting because we can see the whole, we can see outside of the tree, we can see the circle, we can see that which is on the periphery. Again, the analogy is limiting here because what periphery? There's no end to the one. But if we could just imagine that everything that is in this thing is the experience that we have. This is the sensible order. And then that which is outside of this tree, this circular experience, extends out into infinity, in which it is the purity of one, the ground of being, I should say. The question then becomes, will we look at the tree and we look at what's within this circle that surrounds the tree, the spaces of the circle that are within? How do we conceptualize this? Are we to say that these spaces are nothing or no thing, that they don't participate in being, or maybe that they do participate in being, and that these spaces are of a different type? And what I've come to, not only with Plato but also in the Old Testament, is that these spaces are not nothing. Now, we can describe them as nothing, just like I can reach my hand forward and there's nothing but, well, I said nothing. There's nothing but air, right? But it's not no thing. There's something there. Even in the deep recesses of space, we would say that there's nothing. And even in a measured sense, we can say that there may be an absence of identity there. But in an absolute sense, I hesitate to say that nothing is a true quality of our experience. It's more rather a relative quality of our experience. much like difference, it's dependent on the ground of being. The queen is dependent on the king. Okay, so reorienting now back to the beginning. Given that we've expanded this image, how does this change our idea of that which is different? Or rather, how does this change our idea of the definition of a beginning? We could say that the beginning is much like this compartmentalized pluralistic vision that I laid out. And that beginnings are happening all the time, but I think there are different levels by which beginning can occur. If we think about this tree, surely the larger branches and the trunk itself has a unique quality to it, that it participates very strongly in the purity of being, whereas when we get out into the branches and into the leaves, and as the leaves decay and fall into the fall and into the winter, all of these processes that are occurring at the periphery and don't occur near the center towards the trunk is different. There's a certain instability of identity at the periphery, but there's a constancy of identity because of the trunk and because of its closeness to that purity of being that is the ground, that is the one. So as we can see here, it begins, I think, in my mind, to become more clear why the concept of the beginning does not make sense to apply to the one. Because the one's role is to facilitate the order that participates in difference, which includes intelligible and sensible, is the one that assumes the quality of beginning and ending. But we still have a little bit more work to do when it comes to this concept of difference. Because why is it the case that any of this is happening at all? And why isn't there just a purity of being that extends infinitely throughout all time, where it is not necessary for this differentiation of identity to take place? And I suppose throughout the ages there have been many things used to describe this. We can say that there is an agentic quality to the maybe not to the one, not in this, because I would say that the agentic quality may degrade the purity. That's why I say it's not necessarily attributed to the one. But the agentic quality may be an aspect of emergence. And what do I mean by that? I think this agentic quality is something that we value quite highly. And forgive me, this is my experimental mode here, but it's something that we value quite highly. And it's something that is very close to that purity. It is something that meaningfully pulls us to what the purity of being is, so that when as we exist at the periphery, as we are these sort of beacons into difference, into differentiation, we can maintain identity, because that thing, that spirit, is pulling us back to it. And there's a constancy, at that principled level, where the trunk meets the ground, the confluence it feels beautiful. It feels, I don't want to say warm and safe, but it feels right. It feels true and correct. And as I embrace this feeling and I move away from it, sticking with the tree analogy, moving out to the periphery, into the branches and into the leaves, keeping in mind the cyclical pattern of nature and the, at least where I live anyway, the changing of the seasons and how this affects the leaves. But even if it's in an environment where the seasons don't change and the change is not as dramatic, there is a certain lifespan that leaves have on trees, and they grow back and all this sort of thing. I was reflecting a little bit about the contemporary issues of the era, which I won't go through in too much detail, but they're obvious. They've been in the news lately. I'll just give one example. This most recent situation with the ICE shooting of this lesbian woman in, I can't really remember where it's at. Minneapolis. I have to wonder if that's where it is. Let me check. Yeah, Minneapolis. Again, not getting too far into it, but there is relevant factors here. The point that I want to make, that I want to reflect on, is when we find ourselves where we are conditionally as human beings in this analogy, near the periphery, at the end of these branches, we have a lofty responsibility, but also we have a lot of opportunity and a lot of freedom to do as we will. And our choices, outside of just the natural course of things, such that our lifespans are fixed, that we live and that we die, and that there's a certain lack of freedom as it relates to unfortunate circumstances that might befall us, and all of these unfortunate situations that can happen to good people, that bring people away from the faith or from the purity of being. All of these are tough. They're fixed aspects of our reality, disease being one. Outside of this, and considering all of the freedom of space for movement that we do have, that we can influence and control, it's quite obvious that an agent, unlike the leaf that floats on the edge of the tree, it has an ability to transform itself into many different ways, into many different things. It can transcend itself, it can push itself into the future and create something, create a new tree, for example. And it can also be caught within itself. It can do something productive within itself. It can do something destructive. It can bring about its own decay, or it can reverse a trajectory of decay and bring it into something that is useful and long-lasting. The impact of which may be minimal, it's the nature of our experience after all, but meaningful to ourselves and perhaps to our families and maybe for the broader sense, our communities, whatever the situation happens to be. But as we participate with difference, and for all of the historical expressions of our religious fervor, I both lament and also rejoice at the effects that have been observed at the periphery where we maintain ourselves. And I wonder at the complexity of it all, the subtlety of decision-making, the complexity of transformation, the directionality of that transformation, of the impact and its meaning, however small or large. So back to Parmenides. In response to this question, or its justification to the question, do you think that the one can be older or younger than, or the same age as anything? Aristotle, of course, responds, yes, why not? And he says, because if it is the same age as itself or another, it will surely partake of likeness and of equality of time, of which likeness and equality we said the one has no share. Now, I think we've sufficiently gone through this concept of time. Or maybe we haven't. My apologies, but today is a new day, so I'm still gathering my thoughts with relation to where we were. And I think that we had not touched on time, but we were considering measure and dimension. And the definition we were using for measure was to estimate or assess the extent, quality, value, or effect of something. And we talked about the particulars of extent. We talked about the beginning. And now the ending, I think, has a similar environment through which we can understand it. Where we have been would not make it too difficult to understand what the ending is. So I wonder if we should just continue this exercise. I think this would carry us quite far in terms of what Parmenides is saying. But maybe just to speak for a moment on the ending, as we've discussed its beginning. I had an experience today at dinner. It happens to be a Sunday evening, and I saw somebody that I had not seen for about 6 years, an older gentleman, about 40 years older than I am. He happens to be in the highest ranking that is possible for a Freemason. And he went on a religious speech, I suppose. His religion, I'm not too sure exactly what it is. He hates Islam. He is Turkish. His God is nature. And his beliefs are ill-defined. There's a certain scientism that is within his psyche. There's another friend of mine that I have that is an atheist. That is one of those we could call new atheists. But perhaps not too considerate in his thinking. I think there's an inconsistency when it comes to atheism. I don't think it makes any sense. I haven't completely outlined a full sensible definition of monotheism myself, even though I find myself believing in that. But I do have a rational trajectory that gets me there. It's always being worked on and modified, and the work that I have done has brought me anywhere than atheism. And the frustration that I went through in my mind, I didn't express any opinion about anything during the conversation. I don't think I showed any emotion either, but internally I was thinking that I was, number one, bored of the conversation. It seemed to be, in more of a cruel or mean sense, it was a bit of an adolescent exposition. And I found myself thinking, well, you can't just say that it's an adolescent position if you don't have something by which you can identify that excites your heart to make you feel that way and give it good reason. Now, to my friend's point, he was saying that there's something dangerous about belief. That belief itself without certainty, as certainty was grounded in the material side of things, understandably, without measured knowledge, then nothing can really be known. That was, I think, his philosophical argument. Didn't sound exactly that way, but I think it boils down to that. Now, what had unsettled me wasn't the nature of his argument. It was a weakness that I felt that was familiar. It was an uncontrolled burning of the heart that was placed onto some area that I felt was crucial to the maintenance of being. And that inferno, that burning inferno, it felt a bit uncomfortable. It felt painful because I felt it being burned in me. And I felt as though I was sitting in a rudimentary classroom with people that didn't quite have separated out in their minds the difference between religious observance or religious thinking, symbolic thinking, between that and superstition. Also the difference between belief and knowledge. That everything that is known cannot be a belief. There are just some sort of internal consistencies that I found difficult, and I figured if being is going to be burned, sacrificed, then outside of being internally inconsistent, the very thing we can at least do is have some of the rudimentaries down. And I think that's where my disagreement and discomfort came from the most. Now, why do I bring this up? Because I think that this topic is very close to where we are. Speaking of rudimentary, I'm somebody that's in my 30s and I'm just going through this now. And I see how fundamental this is in terms of building information on top of it. Not just understanding of my place in the world, but also of understanding more complex material processes. It's not dependent on it, of course, but I think within the context of it gives a much broader and more sophisticated understanding of things. Okay, so back to this conversation of an ending. So we've established that a beginning is the point at which the ground of being encounters difference and becomes intelligible. And through this analogy, we have sort of the human experience, by which I've been symbolizing as a leaf on a tree existing at the periphery, away from certain fundamental aspects of being, stable aspects of being, perhaps more simple aspects of being in some ways, maybe more complex in others. It's hard to say. But all the same, the tree in particular that I think about is the kind that I have in my regular experience in the Midwest. It is one that undergoes changes in the seasons. The leaves change, they go from this vibrant green to all sorts of different colors, the reds and the orange, to the brown. And in that process, both of budding and coming to be something that's lively and green to something that is brown and fractured and falling off of the tree. We've already discussed that beginning. And now the ending is another curious matter. For it's not the destruction of being. We know that there cannot be absence. Absolute absence. For absolute no thing or nothing is incoherent. It's unstable. No thing would never become something if there is truly an environment of absence. And so the ending comes in a relative way. It comes in a way that is related. And so I have to wonder, when we think about the sensible order, we think about our analogy, I go to thinking about parts. Think about the parts of the leaf. And eventually, the fundamental constituent elements, the components of this previously living structure, and here we have to be careful not to confuse our sensible analogy with that of the intelligible. But as this lively green leaf goes from a place of being to a place of non-being, in the sense of my attention being on that thing, the identity is that leaf, and separating out again into different constituent elements. The leaf decays and it loses its relationship to the tree, such that the tree can no longer provide it with nourishment and maintain life within the cellular structure of the leaf. And so the biological components become inert, inactive, and they break down into smaller pieces. These smaller pieces find some reintegration somewhere. And it's through this reintegration that they participate in another identity. They themselves, when they remain small, I think also undergo another birth, in a certain sense. Because now they are the singular thing navigating the environment, and not a part of this complex machine, biological machine. Not that it wasn't an identity before, but its role is now different because it's free, it's liberated to participate in something else. Now it may fall back into the earth and be consumed and provide nourishment for something else. Perhaps it is burned by human beings, and that carbon dioxide is spewed into the air. Perhaps the molecules and all of this sort of thing find their homes feeding plants for their continued survival. But when we think about this tree and then put our philosophy hats back on, I think about this at the fundamental level, when we say that we have an identity, regardless of the number or the amount or the sophistication of the parts that compose its whole, or its identity, whatever. When something undergoes this shift, when an identity dies, there are many things, perhaps we can say, are lost. For when we say something is lost, we say that we cannot find it. If something is found, then it is something that can be identified. It's something that we know. So for example, I have I'm not sure why I'm going to use this example, but I have a resin statue of the Egyptian god Beset. So it's a cat statue. And I have him sitting on top of a cabinet, a wooden cabinet that houses my cat's litter box. I felt like it was a perfect place to put it. And so it sits up there. Now I imagine a situation in which I misplaced it, in which it gets lost. Now this sense of being lost is only relevant to me, to the subject, because I can no longer attend to its physical being. But this, again, since I said we should put our philosophical hats on, is still a bit too of an analogy. For what we mean in the philosophical space, or perhaps just in intellectual terms, disregarding the subject for a moment, if we can. We say that something may cease to be in one form, but its form is something that is not dependent or rather, the fundamental constituents of that thing is not dependent on its form. If that makes sense. What I mean by that? I mean, if we are thinking about the principle of being, the ground of being, it's this powerful structure that comes up and provides all things with a stable source of being. Like I said, the statue, even if it were obliterated, the being that holds, that provides it its constitution, remains. So one may ask, well, what does that mean in relation to the identity? Is the identity lost? Is it remembered? I'm not sure I have a good answer to that question. But that's not a question that we are being tasked to answer, thankfully. Eventually we will. And perhaps in a different state of mind, I would have an answer for it. And I think I can go on a journey now to think up an answer, but it's not necessary for where we are. I think it would get us too far afield. I think there's a certain way of attributing an intellectual law. We can say that being is neither created nor destroyed. That does not mean that creation as a principle does not exist, but in terms of absolute being, it is never destroyed. For if it was, all things would become no thing. Okay, so the next thing that we have to do is to think about quality. So within our definition, estimate or assess the extent, quality, value, or the effect of something. So quality is not an easy thing to describe. So the first thing I'd like to do is to go over this in a broad first pass attempt. And then I'm going to use the ChatGPT, we're in version 5.2, as a part of my ongoing philosophical chat to give me a definition that's a little bit more succinct, maybe, and then build on that from there. So with regard to equality, if I had to describe the lamp, and if I were to give it qualities, to describe its qualities, I would say that and see here, I find it somewhat difficult to distinguish between a property and a quality. Because what I want to say, in my sort of informal, non-directed or strictly defined, explicit understanding of the word quality, what I wanted to say is that it is a floor lamp. Now I suppose that that's quite descriptive in terms of the kind of lamp that it is. A floor lamp is different than a lamp that sits on the table. For a floor lamp is something that has a broad base, starts on the floor, and then rises in a fairly tall manner. Another quality that I would say that it possesses is that it has a certain shape to it that we would describe within the broad heading of a style. And I think we could probably call it traditional. Traditional in the sense that it's multi-segmental. Each segment has a sort of oval-shaped base sitting on a circular, I don't know what I would call it, circular base. It's another base, I guess. Almost like a vase where it comes down towards the bottom in an oval type shape, and then widens out at the bottom in a circular fashion. And it's narrow at the top, like a vase, and then there are two circles that form. One is smaller, the one on the top is larger. And it gives it this sort of molding type quality to it. An interesting accent, I guess we would say. So in this way, the quality is used to describe its fittedness in one sense, a broader category. But I think we have to imagine that there are plenty of these categories. For lamp is one category. But outside of the things that there are, we could say many things. And we can divide these into many different categories. The lamp just being one. And of this matter of kind, it describes, I think, a certain type of relation to other things that are. So when we think about the etymology of the word quality, it comes from the Latin qualitas, coined by Cicero to translate the Greek poiotis, or poiotis, I don't know how to pronounce that. Its Latin root is qualis, of what kind, what sort. The Greek root, poios, is what kind. So the origin is, of what kind is this? So it's not necessarily speaking about its being, or that it is. It's not how much of it, but what sort of determination it has. And we've spoken of determination a little bit earlier. If something is determined, it is expressed. That is, the intelligible and the sensible meet, and there is something that is determinate out of this structure, out of that reality. So, again, using ChatGPT here, the definition of quality in our refined version, a quality is a kind of determination by which an identity is characterized as being a certain way, without specifying quantity, relation, or substance. A quality is a determinate kind of how something is. Now, since determination is taking a lot of the philosophical load here, we say that it is described as the bounding of intelligibility such that an identity is articulated rather than remaining indeterminate. So it answers the questions, what makes this identity specific rather than vague? What constrains it to be this kind and not every kind? So an aspect of difference, I suppose. So again, going back up to our quality definition. A quality is a determinate kind of how something is. Now this determination, I think, gets into the heart of some of the difficulty, I think, in understanding how the one maintains its ground of being while also having its principle be maintained as a stable structure in the presence of difference. Because again, determination, the process or condition by which something becomes this rather than that. Now, this is quite similar, not the same as the process of introducing difference into something. In order for this to become that, or to turn into that, it's not necessarily, well, I suppose it's possible that if we take its initial condition already as a sensible expressed identity, but also in terms of taking the principle of being and so say, okay, when it encounters this determinate experience, then it becomes this as opposed to that. So I think the examples that we went through on the first pass are fairly sufficient. I think there are varying degrees by which we can characterize a lamp, and there probably is some crossover in terms of properties, and I think that we can have a direct separation of the two, but nonetheless, once again, a quality is a kind determination that characterizes how an identity is without measuring or dividing it. So I wouldn't say that the lamp is X meters tall. I wouldn't say that the lamp is X pounds in weight. I wouldn't say that the circumference of the lampshade is X. I would, as I've said, say that the lamp is a floor lamp, a broad base. I would speak of its style. I suppose I could speak of its purpose. Now, if it is a kind determination, I think that there is many categories, characteristics by which we would classify something that is meant to produce light. But on the flip side, we have to be careful not to intermingle quality with identity, or the fundamental aspect of what a thing is. So earlier I said it's a floor lamp. But if it were to lose the floor lampness, it would change the thing that it is. So it cannot be necessarily a floor lamp. At least the quality cannot be a floor lamp. Now, when I describe the shape of it, the traditional shape, I think that this is closer to quality. It's answering what kind is the lamp's articulation. It's not a measurement. It's not an identity. In the sense that it is identifying it from a different kind. It describes the character of its form. When I used earlier the lampshade, I can't remember if I described it as like a cloth material. The cloth material, I think, would be more of a property, but its expression, its display, that it having the sort of soft or traditional feel would be closer to that property. So if we say it is a lamp, the category of that would be its identity. We say it is a floor lamp, it's just a farther specification of its identity, of its kind. The traditional style is the quality. The overflowing, or flowing rather, oval patterns, oval forms is a quality. The lampshade, being cloth, has qualitative implications, but its expression, because of the cloth material, because of the property, is what we're after. That makes it a quality. So the warmth or the traditional feel makes it a quality. So we have to remember, if removing whatever it is that we are using changes what the thing is, its identity. If removing it changes what kind of thing it is, its identity or kind. If removing it changes how it is, its quality. If removing it changes what it is made of, its property. So the howness is always difficult for me for some reason. But again, if removing it changes how it is, it's a quality. So now going all the way back to Parmenides and his conversation on time. Where does quality fit in here? Now, time would be more of a property than it would be a quality. So, for example, I don't think we would use time as a measure by which we assessed or estimated the quality of sophistication. If we did, it would be tangential or derivative, in the sense that the amount of time an object participated in an environment, that one then got used to its place there, or its place there was such that it required a modification in the environment to make it fit. And by the fittedness, the expression of its fittedness, which, let's say, is traditional, by that quality of traditionalness, the things around it were related. That would be, that relational sense would be a derivative from quality. And so there would be a relationship between time and quality in that sense. And so it would make sense that because of the time that took place, it was necessary for the time to take place, such that we understood better how the qualities of an identity expressed in an environment can relate and modify and perhaps necessitate the change of certain things, certain other material things in the environment. So a useful reflection and relational constraint, I suppose. But when we spoke of extent, I think time has much more of a more relevant place to play there. Now, when we get to value and effect more particularly, I think that time is going to have quite a significant role to play there. But in terms of value, I think that there is a interrelationship here between value and quality, at least in that previous example that I just had. In what way? In the sense that that which is considered to be valuable or sought after, desired, I think can be defined by many different things. There could be many different standards by which something is valued. Time, I think, can have a relationship to value, because if something persists over time, then it probably is going to be valued more highly. If I were to spend the money on a traditional lamp, a floor lamp like I have sitting in front of me, but it only lasted 6 months because of some inherent property in it, maybe the material is weak or it catches fire after 6 months, whatever the case might be, its value to me would go down. But again, it's more of a derivative. It's not a very direct relationship. It's more secondary. But since we're here, let's talk about value. Value is probably the largest concept that we've discussed so far. That probably would beat out extent, and extent was quite fundamental. Now this value, it seems to necessitate a sentient agent that has some desire. For to say something is valuable it is to say a few things: that it is useful, that it is see, here we run into an issue. For the non-philosophically inclined, we would say that it's subjective and leave it there. But that's, of course, lazy. And so we can't just leave it at subjective. We have to understand what the inherent properties are in the confluence or the structure of that which we call value. I think the reason that it's so easy to call value subjective, because what one person's standard is may differ from another. But here, we are operating by similar guiding mechanisms. We could say that it is a particular desire of the heart. We could say that there is some standard by which this value is measured, which very, very well may be so. In the modern economic sense, I think there are plenty of examples through which we have things that are considered to be valuable that have very explicit definitions. Gold and silver would be a couple. That they are fundamental on the elemental standpoint. We value them because of certain properties, but also qualities. Qualities in the sense that they are beautiful. Properties in the sense that they are durable. Maybe that would be a quality, but hard. The hardness makes them durable. Their scarcity probably would be a property because that would have to do with amount. Maybe a derivative property because it's the amount relative to other material things. We would say also that its utility is important. Its utility would be a property, or rather a quality. And it would be useful because of its properties. That it could be used in electronics, perhaps. But there are many, well, maybe a couple more thoughts here. Of something like gold and silver, it is because of those things that we have used to describe it, it has a certain place of stability. The stability is afforded by either those properties or those qualities. So both properties and qualities here are playing together to give a broad, arching stability among many different minds for why something is valuable. Another thing that we would say is valuable, which would be less material, is the structure of family, or even the ability to regulate and effectively control emotions, because it is through that stability that the human race is maintained and continued. And that's certainly something that the human being values. Now, from the human perspective, when I think about our previous analogy of the tree, of its being planted in the ground of being, the ground of oneness, the ground of unity. And I think about the periphery. I think about where we are in the branches, exuding this principle, being aware of the principle within ourselves, understanding that this I was about to ask myself, what is the principle of unity? Would we say that this is a quality? I'm not sure. But nonetheless, I have a hunch by which I would say that we could speak of the principle of unity in this way as it relates to sensible things, but in the absolute, it's more difficult to say if there is that relationship there. But again, nonetheless, where value finds us is where it meets to some degree our purposes. And our purposes vary, much like our opinion about what's valuable. But there are stricter and stricter purposes. And we narrow down these stricter purposes by certain characteristics, like survival. This is one of the most fundamental. Within survival, I think we have an idea of that which is good. The idea of that which is good is, I think, based on the principle of maintaining being over time. So perhaps value, that does have a stronger relationship to time than I thought. But value has also a very strong relationship to being. So do all of these, of course. So today happens to be a new day. And like always, a new day brings new thoughts. Now I was considering where we were yesterday. And it's going to take some time to get back where we were. The matter of value is no simple thing. In fact, this subject is of principled importance, I think. I think it always is, but especially now, when value seems to be so arbitrary, whether it be something in the form of money or in the form of authority. It all seems to be a bit confused and a bit mixed. So I wanted to give a recap of how we've gotten here to the value. Now, strangely enough, we are only on the first question of the paragraph of the two paragraphs that we have read. Do you think that the one can be older or younger than, or the same age as, anything? And so we have these descriptions of an order that utilizes articulation, difference, and in which the unifying principle of the one doesn't necessarily participate in these things. Given that it is the ground of these things, it is necessary for the things to be at all. Now, there's a lot of playground here, and this is something that we've continually recognized over time. But in particular, when speaking of time, I've decided to go to the route of measure, because time is a measure. It's a dimensional aspect by which time can be measured, I suppose. And so the definition that we've been playing with is to estimate or assess the extent, quality, value, or effect of something. We've discussed the extent. We broke that down into two things: the beginnings and the endings, and the overarching theme of boundary in general. Quality. We spend a significant amount of time talking about the quality of something. It is that aspect of something that is fundamental to its character, but it's not something of its material composition. That if it were to be changed, it would change the nature of the thing that we speak of. And then we arrived at value, and here I can't quite remember exactly where the conversation went, but I know that it's not over. So what can we do with this term value? It's a tricky subject because there are two primary things that get in the way. And I think that these two things are poorly defined in the contemporary experience. One is subjectivism, and the other is the term arbitrary. Within one's value set, it's easy, but not correct, to equate value to that which is desirable. But this cannot be the case, because there are plenty of things for which we say are desirable, but in fact do not bring a good end or good outcome. But there is an assumption there that that which is valuable points towards or is oriented towards that which is good. I think that there are farther words that we can use to describe about this alignment. The good is one of them. We can say, generally, I think that there has to be a maintenance of the ground through it in order for it to persist. So being in unity are those principles that must be preserved. I think generation is an extremely important part of that. And in our context, in the human context, preservation and flourishing over time. There are many things, and perhaps the most important things, of our expression, of our movements, our desires. At the heart of them, when they really matter the most, it is the preservation of us, the human being. And of course, in the modern context, there are many liberties that we have, many many things that afford us a subtler lifestyle for which matters of existence do not seem to be as acute as in a case of absolute necessity or survival. And something is valuable, genuinely valuable, insofar as it contributes to the flourishing, to the preservation, or the perfection of one's being. According to its nature, I suppose. So the perfection of our being, in that sense, is restricted, necessarily. It is restricted to the level at which we participate with reality. And I think that is obvious. It sounds obvious. But there's an important implication, because it implies that, again, this is also obvious, that the human being is a small sliver, and his reflections on his experience, and his experience itself, is limited by his capacity. His capacity is limited by the extent of his mind, the capacity to store information, to transmit information. There are plenty of ways in which we could describe how this is the case, that the human being is limited in an absolute sense, ontological sense. But despite his limitations, there are plenty of things for which the human being is free and able to change about himself, to orient himself to something. The preservation of our species is not just a selfish inclination, although there is a value of selfhood there. It's a preservation of a particular type of orientation, an agentic, conscious experience that exists at a certain stratum of reality that has a certain concept of self-worth, and when paired to its understanding of the relation among things, it becomes this experience for which there is this self-worth and self-value, but also a desire to know and to understand, to be connected. To preserve, to maintain that generative spirit. So what that amounts to is the continuation of life, intelligibility, social cohesion, and, as I've mentioned, orientation towards the good. But value, much like everything else that we're talking about, emerges only where there is articulation. And in pure unity, we don't have that. At the ground, the one that we were speaking about. And an interesting side note, if we are to conceptualize a God, given this framework, God would not be equivalent to the One, which is interesting. God would not be inferior to the One, I suppose, but not equivalent to. Anyway, let's get back to Parmenides. So do you think that the One can be older or younger than or the same age as anything? So we've established, as he will say here shortly, that time I recognize that within our definition, the effect is something that we have yet to go over. But I think in many ways we've crossed this territory already. And perhaps we'll revisit it again at some point in the future. But I think that we've satisfied what it means for the One to be beyond this scope of time, because it doesn't participate with it. It's not, time is an aspect of measure. And as we've discussed, measure involves things of articulation. Things of articulation involve difference. They involve both the sensible and intelligible orders, but they involve difference nonetheless. Difference cannot honestly inhabit a unified principle of oneness or being. It can merely play in the playground that is afforded by it. Parmenides says, because if it is the same age as itself or another, it will surely partake of likeness and of equality of time, of which likeness and equality, we said, the One has no share. And again, a good reason for this is that equal, likeness, all of these are relative comparisons. And so there is an articulation if there's going to be some relation. Articulation and relation imply difference. He continues, he says, and we also said that it does not partake of unlikeness and inequality. Now these are just the opposite sides of the coin. They also imply difference. He says, then being like that, how will it be able to be older or younger than, or the same age as, anything? Therefore, the one could not be younger or older than, or the same age as itself or another. So if it is like that, the one could not even be in time at all, could it? Or isn't it necessary, if something is in time, that it always come to be older than itself? Now what does he mean by this? If something is to be in time, that it always comes to be older than itself. Now perhaps he means this in the sense that we start from some initial condition, or if we, I hesitate to say if we consider the one, because it'll get us into difficult territory. But he does say, the one could not even be in time at all, could it? Or isn't it necessary, if something is in time, that it always come to be older than itself? And I suppose that there's a way of seeing this, of understanding this in the following way. If we take anything that is subject to time, I take myself for example. If I am to say, to give myself some sort of attentive initial condition, let's say right now, but now I reflect on that initial condition, I have certainly become older than that initial condition. He said, isn't the older always older than the younger? And of course we know this to be true. Therefore, that which comes to be older than itself comes to be at the same time younger than itself, if in fact it is to have something it comes to be older than. Now, I suppose he's thinking about this in the reverse direction. We assume that time has a linear and directional quality to it, such that, in the example that I used, the initial condition is always the younger. But can we make the initial condition the older? In our case, we can reflect on myself as I am now versus the other initial condition that we set earlier, for which I would be younger in that case. Now, in response to Aristotle's question, what do you mean? He says, I mean this. There is no need for a thing to come to be different from a thing that is already different. So let's think about this for a moment. There is no need for a thing to come to be different from a thing already different. And of course, this would make sense in the principled way when we consider difference. I consider myself and my cat that is obviously purring in my lap. There is not a necessity for me to come to be different from my cat because there's already a state of difference between us. To add an extra state of difference between us would perhaps, depending on the context, separate our articulation even more, or just serve as a place of redundant expression of difference. He says it must, rather, already be different from what is already different. Of course, this must be the case, because if we were comparing it to the one, it would not be possible, because the one is the ground. It gives it its being. Difference is just the way of articulating being. He says it must rather already be different from what is already different, have come to be different from what has come to be different. So, have come to be different from what has come to be different. At first glance, it seems like we're repeating his earlier statement that this sort of double difference being redundant. But if we imagine a situation in which something did not come to be different from something that has come to be different, so for example, my cat has come to be different than everything around it. If I had not come to be different also with my cat, then we would be, of course, in an issue, because then I would not be able to articulate with my cat. I would be my cat, most likely, in that situation. And that wouldn't make any sense at all. And be going to be different from what is going to be different. So that there is a continuation in time, so that our difference, as it has been expressed at the initial condition of our difference, continues, such that we don't somehow spontaneously de-articulate or converge into one identity. So now he says, but it must not have come to be going to be, or be different from what comes to be different. So this is one of the most confusing lines, I think, of the paragraph. What I think he means here is he's speaking about the procedure of coming to be different itself. So we take being, we take our ground, and then we say, okay, there is now this generative process that goes around this experience. And by difference, what we see is the expansion of identity, obviously, and multiplicity. But if we take not just the difference between, or the difference, let's say, of one identity versus the other, we take the process of difference itself, the very thing by which the ground of being is utilized, or rather expressed through difference. If we were to imagine that there was going to be something different that differed from the process or the procedure, what we would have, I think, is closer to a unity of being. Because what it would deny is the process by which identity comes to be. It would deny the process by which a thing can be articulated. Or we can also say it would fail to come to be in relation to anything. So again, I want to read this. But it must not have come to be going to be, or be different from what has come to be different. It must come to be different and nothing else. So in this way, I think what he's establishing is that it must participate in a centrality of that procedure of difference, or encounter of the principle of unity with the experience that would allow for multiplicity to be maintained in some sort of stable fashion or order. And he says, but surely older is a difference from younger and from nothing else. So that which comes to be older than itself must also, at the same time, come to be younger than itself. So we take older and younger. These themselves, two concepts, we form two identities around them. Of the older, we have a comparative term, and of the younger, we have a comparative term. In the former, we have an idea of some advanced age relative to the other. And so our focal point of attention is on that which has progressed beyond the other reference in time. And so it participates in being, in the sense that its origin of identity can be measured on this scale of time. And by its linearity, I suppose, we say that the older is progressed on this x-axis, whereas the younger is closer towards the zero on the x-axis. The confusing statement is, so that which comes to be older than itself must also at the same time come to be younger than itself. So here we are saying, not so much as we identify the coordinates, let's say, of the young and of the old, as we've just mentioned on this x-axis. Let's ignore the y-axis for now. Let's just say on a linear time scale, we have one identity that is older, one is younger. Let's say the younger one is 1 and the older one is 5. whatever units we wish to put to it. If we just focus on the one that is 5, in this instance, in this situation, this is a condition. What I'm describing is a condition. We're not talking about a process when we're identifying this in particular. However, when we move away from this, though we recognize these 2 points both as conditions, they themselves not being older or younger than themselves, because they are this static snapshot of themselves, one relative to the other, in the scale of time. But as we move from the snapshot to more of the dynamic situation, the unfolding situation, or as Parmenides puts it, that which comes to be. So now we have a description of a process. Something is coming to be something. So he says again, so that which comes to be older than itself must also at the same time come to be younger than itself. So we've talked before about how something can become older than itself. If we just take 2 snapshots, one of myself now, one of myself now, I've become older than myself. I'm relatively the same identity that I was moments ago. But now, how can we square, and how is it reasonable to say, based on where we have been, that at the same time, this thing that has come to be comes to be younger than itself? Now, on a linear timescale, and for a being that is under the restriction of time in that direction, in that forward direction, that I cannot willfully turn the clock backwards. I establish an initial condition here. I cannot go back and reach that initial condition. But to stay logically consistent with where we have been in this dialogue, I think we must go to the process of difference. Irrespective of the subject's experience. So again, to back up, he says, but it must not have come to be going to be, or be different from what comes to be different. So this process of coming to be different, strong, stable, a principle in and of itself. He says it must come to be different and nothing else. And but surely older is a difference from younger and from nothing else. So that which comes to be older than itself must also at the same time come to be younger than itself. And I think we have to agree to this because at some point it did come to be. It was, if we take a trillion snapshots at every minute aspect of a second as we can, and we say, within all of these, little snapshots. We have some that are farther in the older direction that we would say on the x-axis, and some in the younger. But all the same, the instantiation of identity has occurred in all instances. And by this instantiation, there has been the expression of that principle of unity, of the one, then articulated such that the intelligible properties of the being, I'm going to say again, have become instantiated, such that it is sensible, it is observable, it is expressed. And so it's not a matter of the subject's view of it. It's more a matter of, has this happened at a place that was at one time younger versus at one time older? And of course, it has. I, at one point, was younger, and I went through that process of coming to be different than as I do now. Because if I did not undergo this process of coming to be different, I would cease to be different from anything. I would reintegrate into the ground. I would be the one. There would be no I. Now he says, but it must also not come to be for more or less time than itself. So what are we saying here? So we're talking about a process, because we mentioned coming to be. We're talking about time. We're talking about amount, more or less. And then we're talking about identity, itself. And the reason for this is, if we take the snapshot of the lifespan of any identity that we're talking about, it could be a rock or it could be a human being. The snapshots only extend so far as the ground of being and the properties that are explained through this articulation and subsequent instantiation are bounded by its boundary. We can identify the thing that it is. If if the thing ceases to be, then it's no longer instantiated, it no longer articulates in a way that preserves the fundamental essence of the thing in question, the identity. There are various things that bring that into view. We could think about participation, we could think about purpose, we could think about qualities, and we could think about properties. All of these are important to that expression. If we were to make the statement that I came to be after I had ceased to be, we would have a or rather I should say, if the time of my identity carried on past the point of the ending, what then would we say? That I perhaps am no longer instantiated. Now, this is difficult business for me. New territory, perhaps. But I'm no longer instantiated. By instantiation, I mean a bounded expression of identity in time. By bounded, I mean that there are rules by which we would classify this identity. Or perhaps rules that allow the identity, or the form, the intelligible, determinate, non-temporal aspect of being, to find a home in a place that is determinate, that is temporal, that is subject to time, and that includes properties, these variable determinations within the instantiation. So I want to back up a little bit and repeat what Parmenides is saying. But it must also not come to be for more or less time than itself. So the time of the self, this is, I think, what we are describing. Now, outside of just birth and death, I wish to speak of the life of the identity in different terms. So, within an instantiated being, we have a particular amount of time for which we would say what? Well, we would say that there's a particular amount of time that it is in the way that it is. And so the question is, well, what remains of the thing, or what is of the, I want to resist the urge to say parts, but what is of perhaps the form or the identity? Again, something that is atemporal, without instantiation. I don't wish to think, because I don't think it's all that reasonable, that there is a separate domain by which all of this is hidden and tucked away. I think that there are plenty of things that are tucked away and beyond view of man, but there are elements that we do perceive, and the very participation that we experience in life, I think, is enough to give us an idea not only of this process of instantiation, but also the existence of being beyond the bounds of time, let's say, that are allotted to it. So the time that is given for the particular instantiation. So before or after, we would have to imagine that the identity is not bound in the way that would allow it to be instantiated. So the question is the identity something that is, if it's not instantiated? And I think we've sufficiently established that it's possible to have something that is not instantiated, because we have the one, or the principle of unity, that is not instantiated. It's required for the process of instantiation, but it itself is not instantiated. So when we live here and we say identity, or we say that which is, does not require instantiation. At least in the case of the one, we have to also then think about a step just below this, because we know that there are plenty of things that the one does not. There are plenty of rules, or the game by which we live our lives. The substructure is the one, and the one doesn't necessarily play the game. It's okay. We move down a step, and we imagine this process of instantiation, but we imagine, again, the contact point at which differentiation is possible, articulation is possible. At this point, I think there's something very interesting, because the question in my mind is, well, where does the difference go? Is it just this sort of random knife that is this sort of cosmic knife that's cutting up being into all these different things, but potential and things that can be, and blah, 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 blah? Perhaps that's the case. Perhaps it's more ordered. The way that things are, in general, I think are rather bizarre. We look out into the cosmos and we have all of these spheres that are rotating around other spheres, and we have these weird laws by which these objects articulate with one another, and we have this possibility of this bizarre thing we call life, and the only thing that we know of it is on this planet, but there are trillions of planets that are out there, most of which we have no idea what they are. We are stuck here, and we're in this sea of ignorance about the whole thing. And this is that which is sensible to us. We've spent so much time thinking about principles and how this is connected, but yet at the same time separate from the material, base material, let's say. So I've distracted myself. Returning again back to this point, where we see an aspect of God, perhaps, that is working through difference, maintained in being, by which things are ordered. And when we think about this, we come to two things. We come to the identities, and we come to the forms. Because within the forms, what we have is something that is not yet instantiated, has not undergone that process by which things are bounded in a way that participate such that an identity can come to be. Now, it's possible to have a concept of an identity. Like, I can think that I want to have a child, for example. So the child can be a thought, and this thought can be put into action, this sort of agentic component, this creative, productive procedure by which something comes to be in that sense. We could say also that things come to be by accident, or seemingly by accident. So today happens to be a new day. I listened to that last part of the recording, and it makes me feel a particular way. First of all, there is an understanding of a profound ignorance to it all. But secondly, I think about the work that can be done here, the productive work that can be done. Now, so far I've sort of resisted speaking about the agentic too highly. Not because I devalue the agentic in a higher form as something that is inconsistent with our experience, but rather the dialogue, Parmenides here, requires us to be narrow in our search, but to go quite deep. And so I sit here now thinking about debating at this sort of crossroad. Do I finish this paragraph or try and have an exercise for understanding or expanding the understanding of some grand agent? I don't think that this is the appropriate time for that. We still have a lot to do thinking about the one, still getting down this idea of instantiation, even though there's been a definition laid forth. It's still going to take some time, for me at least, to internalize what that is, to truly understand it. And same with properties and the characteristics. All of these things, qualities, they appear at once simple, overlapping perhaps for the either the uncertain or the undisciplined or the casual. These need to be very ready to be recalled and understood. So since it's a new day, I sort of want to go right back to our text. He says, but it must also not come to be for more or less time than itself. Now I believe that we've come to a fairly good, well, I see where the issue is. I feel like we've come to a fairly good place insofar as we've identified these beginnings and endings. But what we are uncertain about is the role of identity beyond its instantiation. And so I think that this requires us to go back into our definitional landscape. So I'd like to bring forth a list here of the major terms that we have gone through. Now I've kept a ChatGPT chat following roughly where we have been. I do much reflecting on my own. There are some integrated pieces of information from ChatGPT, but it is all through my reasoning that this has its ground. And so it's a relatively interesting chat in that sense. And it readily pulls up definitions that are consistent where the logic is going. And if there's a misstep in, or a false direction on the part of the chat, then I'm quick to turn it back with speech. Sometimes the recording that I have into this microphone is also going into ChatGPT. Not all the time. Maybe 10% of the time I'll do that. But nonetheless, I say that to say that what we have is a pretty interesting list of the terms that we've been through. And some of the language I haven't really used, but I have used the meaning of the words. Now, the language is more concise from the chatbot because of these definitions. It would take me some time to go through each and every one of these and give it my own language and understanding. But this quick definitional recall, I think, is going to be useful for us here. So we have the one. The definition of this: the predeterminate ground of intelligibility itself. Now, predeterminate is an interesting phrase to use. I understand why we're using it. On one hand, one can make the argument that the one is a determinate thing, that it would rather not make sense for it to be before determination, because the principle of unification is something that is certain. It is something that is very definite. However, the definition of definite is having exact and discernible limits or form. And of course, the one does not participate in that. It doesn't have the definite limits because it provides for the things that require its limits, like objects, like identities, that come to be from the principle and are separated by difference. Separated by choice, perhaps. But by difference is the language that we use to be consistent. So again, the one, the predeterminate ground of intelligibility itself. Now, intelligibility is the condition by which something can be grasped as something, as determinate rather than undifferentiated. So there is a difference, a separation between one thing and another. And we have to keep in mind that this is a condition. I suppose conditions themselves are not the easiest things to understand. There are many states of our being, and many conditions for which the condition necessitates change, or it necessitates action. Perhaps because it is threatening, perhaps because it is within our interest to do something, whatever it may be. That there are a certain set of factors, again, that require action. And I'm not too sure what to say about this condition. On one hand, I think about the different perspectives here. I think about that which is doing the grasping. And given that I am an agent that is grasping, that is reaching out, I find it's easier for me to understand through my experience what exactly this means. But where I get confused is among all of the other things that don't necessarily appear to have the capacity for grasping. What does this word intelligibility mean, then? Now, much like the One, we see kind of a similar thing. Now, intelligibility is not the One, because it is something that participates in our step-down function within the articulate order, within the realm of difference and separation. But it is very close to the One. In the sense, it is much like the One setting up the ground through which the seed is planted and then grows into a plant. So, within this image, I find it interesting. So we have to do a little bit of separating here because, of course, intelligibility exists at a particularly interesting place. A place that we've often come back to, the place that's a bit dangerous in terms of definition, and that is at the place in which identity is the One as the principle of being and of the highest form of unification, how this is maintained when it finds its seed within difference. And this is in and of itself a rather bizarre frame to be in. Because on one hand we have the principle, which is all-encompassing. But on the other hand we have that which is not, that which separates, that which differentiates, that which determines. Is creating this multiplicity. It is making things sensible. It is making it possible for myself to be. Now, there's a particular mode of thought, which we are well aware of at this point, that this multiplicity, or rather non-being and being, participate in each other's experience like that of a husband and a wife. That they have their own roles, their own responsibilities, their own character, their own nature, but ultimately equal. This type of dualism I've never found to be attractive, because I don't think it's entirely reasonable. Just as we would not say that something comes from nothing, I don't think we would also say that something is at once the same as nothing, or let's say being is the same as non-being. That there is a difference even between them. But here in this new undulating, unfolding visual of this, it would also seem to make sense that in attempting to see the purity of unification and of being, separate from that which is not, causes that which is not to be at the center of the mind. And it causes, again, one to have an image of the seed of being within this receptor of non-being. But it would be considered a mistake to say that this receptacle is something that is completely absent, because of course it is not. And the image only goes so far. We have to say that the image only goes so far because that which is not, non-being, no thing, nothing, as we would say, is only a product of difference and not a product of being itself. And so that necessarily means that a strong definition, I think, of that which is not non-being, differentiation, division, whatever, is not necessarily something that is absent, but rather it is something dependent, but also, in a strange way that we have yet to describe, itself an ordered thing. And we like to say random by probabilities. All the while giving orders and rules to those things that participate in those random probabilities. So again, intelligibility, the condition by which something is to be grasped as something, as determinate rather than undifferentiated. So we remind ourselves what exactly it's sitting on top of. It's sitting on top of the one, the predeterminate ground of intelligibility, that which is not articulated, measured, or differentiated, but by virtue of which articulation has possible. The immediate step down for me has always been the most difficult. I at once resist the urge to think about this principle coming up into a space of nothingness. And instead I think about not a separation between myself and this principle, but rather myself as being in a unique opportunity to consider this principle, to consider how it fulfills me. Maybe fulfill is not the right word, but how it finds me, how I am it, and how I'm influenced by this difference. In Genesis, there is an image of this expanse and the separation, the waters above from the waters below. And while this image can create many different types of reasons and explanations for things, at the moment I see this image as not necessarily a ground of material and a high of non-tangible things, as perhaps I once did. Or maybe perhaps not, because as I think about it now, I think about the heaven being the expanse, opening up, and what it opens up again is not absence, it's not difference within that separation. What it opens up is possibility. Now within this experience of the one participating in, or the one maybe I could say participating in for now, a type of relating that we do describe as sensible, that we describe as differentiated, determinate, articulated. And the real trouble, again, once and always, is to imagine a sophisticated enough picture to justify the place of this difference, to justify the place of articulation within something so pure, or rather, not within it, because of course we would be thinking about parts, but on top of it, perhaps. Language here is such a funny thing. There's another temptation to say that being is all, it permeates all. And I think I can say this statement, no problem. But not at the expense of having the one reduced to the part. Now the one, or that which is and being in general in the sensible order, is something a little bit different from the one, and I think we have to keep that differentiation. Same principle, but articulated differently. Or I should say, articulated at all. So, today is a new day, and I'm looking forward to wrapping up this episode because it's gone much longer than it should. So I'm going to start by leaving some obscure prayer in this podcast, or in this episode of the podcast. A prayer for which nobody will ever really know of its existence. And it's something that I find fascinating in the sense that I can create this thing that may be long-lasting, upload it to YouTube, and then for my enjoyment, perhaps I come back to it later and listen to it. Or perhaps there is, in the future, some potential person that finds it, but it's just one or two people that ever hear this obscure thing, and even the prayer itself might not be all that interesting or important. But it's just the thought of it that I find interesting, of burying something personal in a place where it is quite difficult to find. So, dear Lord, thank you for this day, and I thank you that I can be here. It's not often that we come to this medium through the podcast, but I'm thankful for the day. And there were events, as with many days, though differing based on degree or scale, there were events today for which I felt the mind move towards absence. That I was not participating in the expression of being in a way that was oriented towards the good. And for these instances, I ask or I pray. I don't ask, I pray. I reflect on the truth that you have provided us. That while although we may make mistakes, there is that possibility of correction. So assuming we accept what we must. And it's for these things I pray on, that I may not be too so easily dissuaded by those difficult aspects of life, and participate fully despite the discomfort. And with this I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So we are coming to the end of the paragraph that we've been on. But it's been a tricky subject. Perhaps it's just there's a component of this for which my understanding is limited, and it takes me a bit more time to really conceptualize this. But the different terms, at the very least, are becoming, or have become, clear in view. Their definitions still, to me, can be a bit variable and not as concrete. And no doubt there has been many exercises to produce this concreteness of understanding, but I think it's still going to take some time. So I'd like to return to this sentence that seems to be nagging. We can't seem to get past it. Parmenides says, "But it must also not come to be for more or less time than itself." Now, where we have been is a bit tangential, but from what I remember, it is within the procedure of coming to be. Instantiation was an aspect of that. This discussion of properties and qualities is related to that. But we'll give that some breathing room for now. What I'd like to do is to rely solely on the exercise of mind and not use the internet for springboarding conversations or for definitions. While although it's very important, it needs to be put on the back burner for now. But it must also not come to be for more or less time than itself. I think we've talked about that a fair degree. But I want to give an overarching image, just to consolidate it in my mind. So we have this ground. Maybe I should say first, when we think about reality, we have this ground. We call it a ground of being. It's not a material thing. It's not reducible to dimension or to measure. It is the principle of unity. It is the principle of oneness. And by this oneness, we have the possibility for all of the sensible things that we perceive. But in the very, if we can call it beginning, I'm not sure we can actually call it beginning. Because being is something that permeates experience regardless of that thing. An interesting reflection, though, if being, or if oneness, is something that is continuous throughout all temporary experiences, what are we to make of it? It's quite easy to imagine, especially from an agentic standpoint, how there would be relevance, how there would be a majesty unparalleled to our imagination. And I speak on that with regard to the agent that is speaking. Because from the inside of what I'd rather stupidly call the matrix, or from the inside of the program, a user perhaps, it's so difficult to imagine the programming, the programmer, all of the important aspects of being, or rather I should say, the foundations of being that maintain themselves regardless of the way of things. So anyway, we have this unity, we have this principle, and we have this expanding in our mind ways of participation, such that difference can find itself within reality to provide articulation, to provide identity, or to facilitate identity, to facilitate multiplicity to a degree, to facilitate articulation, relation. And there's good reason why in former dialogues we've used this landscape to describe the queen, and the king as that of being, both of which we were using it more in the sensible sense, I think. Articulated sense, moreover, because we have a few divisions. We have our sensible order and intelligible order, and then we have our articulate order versus purity of being. And in the Sophist, we were discussing, I think, mostly an articulate order, both of sensible, but then also of primarily just intelligible things. Here we wish to see the whole picture. Now, of these relations that I had mentioned between this purity of being and the ways in which the purity of being can be expressed, this, in some sense, is all that we see, all that we are able to do, all that we perceive, again facilitated by difference. We've used a number of analogies, one being this large tree analogy. through which, all around the periphery, we have this being, this concentrate being. And the inside is not as though we have the lack of being, or an unconcentrated being, but being with characteristics. Being that is that follows certain laws, a certain order to this. And within this, we have variable identities. These identities have aspects of them that are unique to them, that require that uniqueness within the bound of the identity is the thing that expresses the form, that expresses something that is intelligible. It becomes instantiated, or it goes through the process of instantiation, maybe I should say. And although I'm still wavering, I should say, when it comes to the exact definitions of things, I think of qualities, of how something comes to be, or of how something is expressed, maybe. Now, I hope I said properties here, not qualities. And then qualities of a more intimate term related to the identity of the thing. Because regardless of what words we use, we have to understand that the aspect of something, the congregation of those things together within bounds that are necessary for its being, are necessary to maintain the attention on the thing that is. If we're to break away into such multiplicity that we can no longer perceive it as one thing, then that would be an issue, or maybe perhaps it wouldn't, but it would nonetheless change our observation. And then also, we have to understand the thing that is, what causes, maybe not what causes its being, but what is its being? How is its being different from the unity of being, such that we can appreciate its maybe I shouldn't even say that. We know how it is at a fundamental sense, but we should know how it differs from other things. How its being, the way that it participates in the principle of being, how it chooses, or how it maintains itself, how that light cone, as is the popular expression these days, is maintained. Now, when we think about coming into being and time equal to itself, the first thing, perhaps this is adolescent, I don't know, but the first thing I think of is sort of like a lament, a melancholy at the finality of things. And there has been language that is out there, that has been used, that has been so difficult for me to comprehend or to understand. And that is, in one sense, those things that transcend the sensible order and maintain themselves, because the mind has been indoctrinated to understand this maintenance as something entirely fantastical. That all of the images that have been produced by which we can imagine and to believe, and all of this have become bastardized in the manner that they no longer maintain a type of relevance, of coherence, and attention, magnetic capacity to draw attention, I should say. And so while I find myself sort of in this wilderness of trying to rationally debate myself on various topics, one of the ones that I find so difficult now is the extended relationship between the order that I actively live out and the order that I know is beyond me. Again, I conjured up an image earlier about the agent that is participating on the coder software, and how I wish so firmly to understand more deeply about my place in the whole picture of it. And while in my time, in my days, I may make progress on it, I may not, I think nonetheless, giving myself some justification, that it is my responsibility to believe in something, but not something without reason. And so that's the purpose of exercise. Over time, we get bits and pieces of things that we find valuable, that encourage our belief. Other times, there are things that break our understanding or our wishes, our desires about a certain thing. But this is all a part of the exercise. In the end, it ought to make us stronger. But aside from that little pep talk, I suppose this sentence here that I've been struggling with in some sense is because of the finality of things, in the sensible but in the articulate order. And it would seem, from a principled standpoint, being is not destroyed. It is just changed or transformed. And while we understand that there are many connections, quite intimate connections between identities, and extended connections, by which I mean an identity in one area may fit a small piece of a narrative of some thread that runs through it all. And it becomes a pattern, maybe it's a principle, by which we can identify, observe, learn from. Fight over. But all the same, I wonder about the extent of these relations. And surely as I've gotten older, I've appreciated these relations much more. Again, in their identification. And in my appreciation of them, but also my desire to find them. Parmenides, but it must also not come to be for more or less time than itself. It must come to be, and have come to be, and be going to be, for a time equal to itself. This is something perfectly reasonable. I know I asked the question before, but it begs the reflection. And what would it require for something that is for a time that is unequal to itself? That wouldn't make any sense. It would be impossible. It would be a contradiction. Because the boundaries that we set for the equivalence is set because, or I should say, is set based on the relative relations among those properties and qualities that maintain the thing, or that express the thing. Once these migrate into sufficient difference in the order that had held prior the form, or prior the identity, then that which is no longer is. It is, but it is in a different context. And so I think about my own being, and I think about the stratification of this principle. Not of the being, but the stratification of what we're talking about in terms of the disintegration of boundary, such that things move multiplicitously and participate differently, depending on the context. The mind is such a fascinating thing, and the attention that accompanies it. For there are various mental states that we all inhabit, day in and day out. We wish them to be relatively consistent, but there are times in which, in our weaker moments, that pinnacle of attentive acuity fails us. And it's not just a matter of arousal or alertness. There's much more. It's arousal, but it's also orientation, participation. And these wax and wane throughout the day naturally. They wax and wane based on our desires. They wax and wane based on our ability to navigate our desires and the natural consequences of our experience. When fatigue and exhaustion set in, sometimes we need rest. There's no way around it. We don't function well if certain needs are not met. But I bring all of this up because within the principle of, what would we say? Maybe it's not a principle, but this general concept of something having, or coming to be, being, going to be, having a prescribed limit on it. And within the dynamism of mind, all of the possibilities for which it is afforded. And while we may say our will is bounded, its bounds and its rules by which it may manifest seem so abundant. And just reflecting on the day-to-day and my mistakes in life and the things that I know I need to be doing better, and of the difficulties that I have striving and achieving that level, each step of the way there is this disarticulation, by which the mind, on one hand we could say disassembles, but it doesn't disassemble in the most innocent of senses. The innocent would be winding down before bedtime, going to a friend's house and maybe having a beer or two, unwinding, joking, being jovial, refreshing the mind with social interaction. This isn't what I mean. It is the deliberate fall into hollow desire that destroys the soul. It destroys the productive spirit. And the way it does so is multifactorial, I think. There are many ways in which it's identified, but there are many ways in which it's not. It's more intuitive, subtle, and not recognized until years have passed. And one looks back and asks the questions, why? Why did it happen this way? To which, in my professional life, I have been guilty of saying we can get lost in the causes of things, which is true. And the reason I bring that up is because from the point that I mention it forward, we can think differently. We can be transformed, we can be forgiven if we so choose to accept forgiveness. Perhaps therein lies the heart of the matter. What are we accepting when we ask and are offered forgiveness? I suppose it depends on the context. But experience would seem to suggest that there are sacrifices associated with it, no doubt. One of which requires your constant attention. And this is also where I think that arousal comes into play as well. We constantly need to be aware of that participation. Constantly observing and reflecting on things, which is exhausting. But it's necessary if we wish to move forward. And by moving forward, I wonder what I mean. I think it has to do with expanding the light cone. Meaning, either expanding the bounds of identity or tightening the bounds of identity. Now, I can imagine that there would be difficulties with both. And usually, sophistication lies somewhere in the middle. So again, it's like tinkering in this complex machine. Parmenides says, therefore, it is necessary, as it seems, that each thing that is in time and partakes of time be the same age as itself, and, at the same time, could be both older and younger than itself. And here we establish that this is possible because of the bounds of identity. And the bounds would be articulated by at least in part, that of the dimension of time. And because of this fact, we would be able to see in a snapshot the older and younger versions along with the initial condition. For what am I going to be saying about myself now? In one sense, this nowness is present, but also as I'm traveling through time, I imagine a fast car on the highway, 100 miles an hour, let's say. I'm going quick, and every instant there's another place, another now that has gone by. And at each moment, I can go back and I can see that younger self. And I can do the same as I move forward into the older self, away from the now that was made concrete a moment ago. And Parmenides says, but the one surely had no share of any of that. Therefore it has no share of time, nor is it in any time. Aristotle says, it certainly isn't, as the argument proves. So I think we're going to end this episode here. As I've mentioned, the podcast has gone on much longer than the standard episode. So until next time with part 8, we will continue with Parmenides.